the next time there is a red wave election, an election resulting in Republican majorities in the Senate and in the House, and assuming with that election, we also get a Republican president. With only a 51 vote threshold, Republicans, conservatives could pass all kinds of policy reforms that lately, these days, for the foreseeable future, we would never otherwise be able to enact with the 60 vote threshold. That means everything from defunding Planned Parenthood to building a border wall to making all kinds of changes to federal labor laws, collective bargaining agreements, all sorts of conservative priorities, including ramming through things like school choice, for example. All of these things could be on the table, not to mention budget reforms, regulatory reforms, eliminating federal programs, dramatically slashing the federal budget. And so for the first time, really, since the emergence of the modern conservative movement, the entire Republican Party's platform would become legislatively achievable. Now, to many of you, this might sound like a really good thing. And many of you might now be thinking, gosh, if that's the case, if that's where this logically leads, then maybe we should hope that the Democrats nuke the filibuster. I don't agree with that. Well, nuking the filibuster might be tempting for both sides. I think ultimately it would be bad for the Senate and it would be bad for the country. First of all, it would result in whatever gains either party achieves through this process being rendered very short term, escalating and dramatically increasing the political temperature in the country, and making our political conflicts much more contentious and potentially more violent. As our nation grows bigger and more diverse and unfortunately more divided, we really should be seeking consensus, not from, and I think that means we shouldn't be trying to resolve our problems through zero-sum partisan gain whenever we have the chance. And I think we need to have the prudence to check our own ambitions and our own power at the same time. Ultimately, it would mean that both parties would have even less of an incentive to build consensus coalitions. Our elite-driven institutions would, I think, tend in those circumstances to self-reinforce. And our politics would almost certainly sink to an even angrier and more toxic level. And so even though both parties, including my own, could look at this and conclude, oh yeah, that sounds exciting, that sounds great, let's do that, I think they have to consider whether we really should do that, and whether that would be good for the country as a whole. The Senate, from the outset of the Republic, from the time of George Washington, was intended to be the cooling saucer, the place where the tea would slosh around and cool. It was a body that could allow for emotions to temper. And I think the 60 vote cloture standard, and the filibuster in particular, could really help with that. We also, I think, have to be vigilant in watching out for and resisting measures that may appear to be smaller than nuking the filibuster, but could be just as destructive. There are all kinds of ways that they could try to get around the filibuster, try to get around the cloture standard, while claiming not to have nuked it. For example, they could try to change the so-called Byrd rule, the rule that manages what can and cannot be passed using the Senate's budget reconciliation rules, which, as I said, are a significant but very narrow exception to the 60 vote cloture standard. If they do that, let's suppose if they try to do that and change it, for example, to increase the minimum wage, that should be perceived as the deployment of a tactical nuke. It may be a smaller explosion, but it still has the same impact. It still would amount to a pretty fundamental change to taking what it takes to pass most legislation from 60 votes down to 51 votes. So there are a lot of ways in which this could unravel, but it doesn't necessarily require the Democrats at any given moment to all vote in favor of going nuclear. And that's one of the reasons why we've got to watch out for this, notwithstanding the fact that we've got a couple of brave members, including my colleague Joe Manchin from West Virginia, and my friend and colleague Kirsten Sinema from Arizona, a graduate of BYU, my alma mater. They've both come out and said that they would not support nuking the filibuster. They wouldn't vote to do it. There are other ways in which this could arise. Let's imagine, for example, the Democrats bring up legislation through budget reconciliation that doesn't fit within the Byrd rule and therefore would be subject under the proper application of the Senate rules to a 60-vote cloture standard. Let's suppose further that Vice President Harris, recognizing the possibility of a tie vote, 50-50, given that that's the alignment of Republicans to Democrats in the Senate, that Vice President Harris was sitting in the presiding officer chair, ready to cast her deciding vote. If she, being there already, arriving that day potentially to cast that vote, any procedural rulings that she makes while in the chair, which she can make regardless of what the parliamentarian is whispering in her ear and is advising her, any rulings that she makes they stand, unless you get 51 votes to overturn her. And so this shows how relatively easy it could be for them to deploy a so-called tactical nuke. One final thing I want to say about the filibuster before we open it up to any questions you may have. A lot of people raise a legitimate concern about the fact that there are many things, including many important pressing issues, that end up not being debated because of the 60-vote cloture standard. This, I believe, I am fully convinced, reflects not a flaw in the filibuster itself or in the cloture standards themselves. It reflects instead a distorted way in which we've been applying the filibuster. In other words, as I explained at the outset, the whole purpose of the filibuster is to allow any member to speak at any length that he or she chooses, subject to a limit, meaning that 60 senators can bring debate to a close. If we really applied this the way that it was supposed to be applied, then it wouldn't operate as the same sort of arbitrary feeling that there is a heckler's veto of sorts that can be exercised at any moment by 41 senators. If instead what you required is for people to actually speak as long as they wanted to speak, there are other Senate rules that can take care of the rule so that it doesn't become used in an excessively dilatory fashion. For example, Rule 19 of the Senate rules allows for the Senate to limit the number of speeches that a particular senator may give on a particular legislative day while on a particular legislative project. And so this would end up requiring, as a condition for wanting to prolong debate and thus delay getting to legislation, there are ways of controlling the dilatory use of the filibuster that shouldn't and that shouldn't mean that in order to address the sometimes dilatory and abusive use of the filibuster, that we have to nuke the whole thing. With that, let's open it up to questions, and I'd be happy to answer any that you might have.
Thank you, sir. We called this webinar Holding the Line. We could have just as easily called it Scared Straight, because this is a concerning topic. I mean, the fact that right now the filibuster is in jeopardy, whether it's through the nuclear option or an end run, as you described, the tactical nuclear option of reconciliation. I do think the filibuster is in jeopardy. I thought your last point was phenomenal. that we shouldn't be afraid of deliberation or debate. In fact, it's a feature of the Senate, and it isn't the filibuster that keeps us from enjoying that debate and having the fruits of it that we deserve as Americans. But it is the culture of the Senate, perhaps, or the refusal to enforce certain rules that mean we don't get the debate that we deserve from you all, our senators, as Americans. I want to dive into a couple of things, and then we've got some questions from the audience racking up here. I want to look at the universe of legislation that perhaps enjoys 51 votes but doesn't enjoy 60 votes. You have a very nice way of putting things, and you said that legislation isn't compelling enough to get to 60, but you went on to say, to hint at the fact that that's where you find the stuff that can absolutely tear us apart. Because it can get 51 and not 60, it means it enjoys unanimous or almost unanimous support by Democrats and unanimous or almost unanimous opposition by Republicans. That's where it's most divisive. Either that or that's where something is being tried to ram through at an expedited pace. But I'm concerned about the temperature in this country and how divisive things currently are. If that's the agenda of the 117th Congress between 51 and 60, I think we're in for a lot of trouble. Can you tell us what that, in your view, what those bills are, what those policies are that might live there?
Yeah. So yeah, in this Congress, if all of a sudden we woke up and through whatever stratagem they had gotten rid of the filibuster, they had nuked it in any of the dozens of ways that they could possibly nuke it, there are a lot of changes that I would expect them to enact rather promptly into law. I think you'd end up seeing legislation increasing the minimum wage significantly. I think you'd see legislation declaring statehood for the District of Columbia and for Puerto Rico. I think you'd see legislation increasing the number of justices on the Supreme Court for 151 years. That has been set. That is a number set by statute, of course, but it's been set for 151 votes, 151 years at 9 members of the Supreme Court. I think they would increase that perhaps to 13. I think you'd end up seeing a federal overhaul of the way elections are carried out in the states. And with that, you'd probably see mandatory mail-in balloting for everybody, and a lot of other changes to federal election law, resulting in a massive federalization of things that are themselves supposed to be carried out by the states. I think you'd probably see a significant move towards some sort of Medicare for all program, and you would also see a significant move toward many of the objectives of the Green New Deal. You'd see an increase in tax rates and a more progressive curve within the federal income tax code that would be significant. I think all of those would be things that they would pass pretty much right off the bat.
So considering that, I'm going to go to a question from the audience here. This one's from Johnny Slimrod. He asks, if the Democrats nuke the filibuster, either by lowering the cloture threshold for legislation or expanding the Byrd rule to include policy changes that are non-budgetary, can you describe some of the methods Senate Republicans have at their disposal to retaliate? So one, is there anything you can do to stop it? And two, what would come next? You described that both parties would come to regret this. So both those questions to you, sir.
Yeah, great questions. And yeah, Johnny, this is a point that we absolutely ought to be discussing. So I'm glad you raised it. There are a number of reasons why this approach, the approach that would involve a simple majority in the Senate, saying notwithstanding our rules, we can pass anything we want with a simple 51 vote majority. There are reasons why we call that the nuclear option. Part of it refers to the sort of mutually assured destruction environment. And it also refers in part to the fact that it would quickly metastasize into other areas of the rules. Let me explain what I mean. And this, the answer to both sides of that question are basically the same. In other words, one part of the question is, what can we do to stop it and to prevent it? And another is, what would follow in the immediate wake of a deployment in one form or another of the nuclear option? They are basically one and the same. First of all, our exhortations, our explanations of things that could happen in the future are themselves helpful. But it's also helpful for us to point out what the immediate consequences to them would be of doing this. You have to remember that in the Senate, basically everything we do relies on unanimous consent. Within the Senate, we ask for and routinely give and receive unanimous consent on just about everything we do. I mean, you've got to have unanimous consent for committees to meet after 2 p.m. You've got to have unanimous consent to adjourn for the day or for the weekend. You've got to have unanimous consent to set up almost any arrangement that we have, to set up almost any vote on almost any topic. Once somebody has betrayed the trust inherent in the Senate rules, at that point, the party aggrieved by that, the minority party in this circumstance, could and undoubtedly would come to the floor and start objecting to everything. I mean, literally everything. Committees wouldn't be able to meet past 2 p.m. In many instances, committees wouldn't be able to meet at all. It had become almost impossible to toggle between the executive calendar, where we're confirming people, and the legislative calendar, where we're voting on legislation. There are ways to do it without consent, but it becomes very difficult and very cumbersome. Adjourning for the weekend, for the week, or even the evening would become very difficult. All those things would result in votes. Those votes would in turn tie up the Senate in an endless series of roll calls. You even have the ultimate possibility, which I think would quickly become a reality, one that Senator McConnell referred to last week, which is that under the Constitution, you have to have a majority of senators present in order to have a true quorum, in order to pass legislation or confirm nominees. And in the absence of a simple majority, they're without a quorum. In theory, in addition to objecting to everything else, which it would itself grind the Senate to a halt, there's also this possibility of 50 senators not showing up and not giving the Senate a quorum in order to get its work done. So even if we never even had to get to that second stage, and I'm not sure we would, because I think the first stage would bring the Senate to such a grinding halt that it wouldn't be able to do anything. There are a lot of things about the nuclear option that are suboptimal, to put it mildly. Suboptimal as defined here by making it impossible to do anything in the Senate at all. Without the Senate, you can't pass legislation. Article 1, Section 7 makes clear that you've got to follow a consistent formula when passing any federal law. You've got to have passage both in the House of Representatives and in the Senate. And if we don't function, what they do in the House doesn't have any meaning.
What you just described is a total breakdown of the United States Senate. And we should all be very concerned about that. I think it is exactly what flows from a decision to eliminate the filibuster. I don't think that there's any engaging in speculation there. I don't even think there are really decisions that will be made. I think that that is a necessary recourse. It's it is the next domino to fall, so to speak. I just want to get one more very quick audience question in here before we have to go from that very concerning future to one I think we'd rather live in. This is a great question from Laura Jenkins. What institutional changes would best promote deliberation, particularly constitutional deliberation in the Senate? We're going from shutting down debate to actually opening up more debate. How do we get there?
Yeah, Laura, great question. The most important thing we could do there is to have more of what the filibuster is designed to protect in the first place. We ought to have more debate rather than less. The whole objective of the theoretically unlimited debate, at least on the legislative calendar, consists of allowing members to draw attention to legislation that's pending and consistent with that, offering up proposed changes or amendments to that legislation. The more we can unlock the Senate floor to allow for more of that to happen, the more steps we could take to encourage members to remain on the floor, to have these debates, and to vote more often on more amendments to more bills. That would itself lower the emotional political temperature in the room, at least within the Senate it would. And through that, I think it would help lower the temperature in the country as well. What we've had over the last decade and a half to 2 decades is somewhat unprecedented in the Senate. And it's a problem of bipartisan creation. It's happened, unfortunately, under Senate majority leaders of both political parties, where increasingly you've seen fewer roll call votes taking place. You've seen a rise in the phenomenon of bills, particularly in the spending bill arena, that are negotiated and written behind closed doors by a small handful of people, you know, possibly 4 members of Congress at the end of the day in charge of it, meaning the top Republican and the top Democrat in the House and in the Senate. And then those bills are very often brought to the floor at the very final moment before the expiration of a spending period in order to prevent a government shutdown. Members of both political parties in both houses are told, you've got to vote for this, even though you won't have time to read it. This came to a head, this manifested itself in a really nasty way just a few weeks ago, when at the expiration of a spending period and just before Christmas, we were presented with a 5,593-page spending bill and told we could take it or leave it, but there would be no opportunity to debate it. There would be no opportunity to amend it. This kind of mechanism, the timing with which things are brought to the floor, and especially at the end of a spending period. And then in the Senate, we call it the filing, cloture, and filling of the tree, a procedural mechanism used by majority leaders to forestall any debate or at least any substantive amendments, causes problems. But Laura, the flip side of that is it's relatively easy to undo. If you open up the Senate and allow and encourage more debate, and in particular, if you made the exercise of the filibuster right contingent upon the willingness and inclination of individual members to speak, then you would have more of what the filibuster rule was actually there to establish in the first place. And you would have less sort of mindless obstruction, which is what this has evolved into. And so I think we can do better. And it doesn't require us to have harmony. It doesn't require the acquisition of 60 votes in the Senate by a single political party. By the way, that hasn't happened in the Senate in the last century. I think in the last century, the most votes that the Republican Party has had in the Senate has been maybe 55 or 56. So we can't just sit around for that day to happen, nor do we need to conclude that everything will be tumultuous or difficult until then. What we need is for the Senate to function according to its own rules. But consistent with that, for those rules to work the way that they have worked for a long time and can work again, we've got to also respect the rules that we now have. We can't do that in an environment in which people just nuke the filibuster.
Well, thank you, sir. I want to end by giving you 2 messages on behalf of the Heritage Foundation. One is thank you for being here. Your explanation of this is invaluable to our audience from the conservative movement that joined us. And the second is, if the Heritage Foundation can be helpful to you and your colleagues in protecting and preserving the filibuster, please let us know. We will do all in our power to help you protect this we see this as one of the most critical priorities for this year, for this Congress, for this presidency, and really would in any context. Thank you, sir.
Thanks so much.